Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Canada's most irreverent talk show. I hope it's exciting anyway. It is Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022. Hope you are all having a wonderful day wherever it is, just after 6:46 here in Ottawa, where I am coming to you live from just a couple of blocks away from Library and Archives Canada, where the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings have been taking place. And it's funny because the whole point of this commission is looking into Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act. And in that little pre-roll intro, if you're watching the program live, you'll see a lot of footage from our coverage, and specifically from my coverage at a couple of points of the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And whenever I see it, I get chills. And I don't mean that in an emotional way. I mean, I actually get like post-traumatic freezing from just remembering how bloody cold it was in downtown Ottawa when we were out there. And you can just see the condensation coming whenever I'm talking to someone or doing an interview. But this is what we do because we love you and believe in the work that we're doing. And it is worth withstanding the minus bajillion degree cold to do it. And that's been one of the themes that's come up, I should say, from some of the convoy organizers who have been testifying. They've been talking at length about the love that they felt, the unity they felt, the peacefulness they felt, and how all of that really triumphed over their frustrations with vaccine mandates, their difficulties with the cold, and all of these other hurdles and adversity things that were standing in their way. And we heard from more participants of the convoy today. I don't want to say organizers, because that term doesn't actually fully apply to what was happening. Keith Wilson, who is a convoy lawyer, spoke this morning. Now, I've interviewed Keith and spoken to him on a number of occasions. He was planning, as I understood it, to be representing convoy organizers in this commission process that's going on right now. And there was a change that took place at some point, and he kind of hinted at it when I had him on my show a few weeks back, just before the commission hearing started, where all of a sudden he's now a witness. Because again, he was in the thick of this. He was on the front lines alongside Tamara Leach, alongside Chris Barber, alongside a lot of these other players, talking to police. He was in on the negotiations with the city of Ottawa. So he is as much a participant as anyone else. And he offered a fair bit to that effect as a witness. After Keith Wilson, Tom Marazzo spoke. And again, Tom Marazzo, a guy I've had on the show on a number of occasions, a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I just realized a moment ago that my poppy that I was wearing so dutifully and diligently all day, I think fell off in the last 20 minutes as I was getting to my hotel room. So I'm going to put on my backup poppy once we're playing a video clip here in a couple of moments. So don't be alarmed at the continuity error if I don't have one moment and I do the next. But I'll get to Tom Marazzo in a second. And then later on, Pat King came. Now, Pat King is a very interesting figure. And I say interesting in the course of understanding the convoy, the media's response to the convoy, and also understanding in general the landscape of alternative media in Canada. This has been the first time Pat King has been able to speak since the convoy, because he spent a lot of time behind bars. And I've made no bones about it. I've made no secret about it. I am not a Pat King fan by any stretch, but I felt that what happened to him at the hands of the state, at the hands of the Crown, was unconscionable. Whatever unpleasant comments he's made in the past, I do not feel that he was being accorded due process, and it is still not exactly clear what he did that warranted his imprisonment. Now, he'll have to answer for those charges. That's not what he was doing today. But he has, very similar to Tamara Leach, bail conditions that preclude him from speaking. And, you know, as will become very evident in this show in particular, when witnesses go in and come out of the hearing room, they are oftentimes subjected to what are called scrums in Canadian political parlance. And that's an opportunity for a gaggle of reporters to get around, and they just all yell and bark questions at you. And maybe you take one, maybe you take 20. Maybe you do what Keith Wilson did today and just like keep taking questions for like 40 minutes. And Pat King, by a couple of comments that I got from people that spoke to him, wanted to speak, but couldn't because he didn't want to be arrested for violating or allegedly violating his bail conditions. So he walked right by, A couple of people shouted out questions. He didn't stop. He didn't answer. His lawyer turned around and I think said no comment or no questions, whatever it was. Now, Tom Marazzo is in a bit of a different boat here. Tom Marazzo is allowed to do interviews. He's done many. He's done alternative media. He's done my show. He's done Rebel. In fact, we spoke to him today. Tom Marazzo did not want to scrum with mainstream media. Take a look.
Mr. Marazzo, let me ask you a couple questions.
You guys have been lying for 3 years. I don't want to talk to you.
Okay, sorry, it's 8 seconds. I feel like we can play it probably 5 or 6 more times and still enjoy it, but let's just do one more here.
Mr. Marazzo, let me ask you a couple questions.
You guys have been lying for 3 years. I don't want to talk to you.
There we have it. Him saying, you guys have been lying for 3 years. I don't want to talk to you. And there was a little, I don't know if it was I don't want to talk to you right now or why would I want to talk to you. But the key part that you guys have been lying for 3 years, not talking. And then what happened, he goes around the corner. And if you don't know the layout of the building, you're not missing much. But he goes around that corner. You see my camera follows him. And then he proceeds to stop like 8 feet later and take like 5 questions from William Diaz at Rebel, and then takes a couple of questions for me, which we'll play shortly. And then the part that you don't see on there is one of those guys that was shouting at him when he came down the first way, shouts out, a question, and Tom Marazzo says, who are you with? And the guy says, I'm a reporter with Le Devoir, and Tom just throws up his hand and turns out and walks away. So Tom Marazzo did what many of the Freedom Convoy participants and organizers did back in January, February. He said, I'm not talking to legacy media. And he said specifically to them, you guys have been lying for 3 years. I'm not going to talk to you. Now, as far as media strategy goes, you can decide for yourself whether this is the right course of action or the wrong course of action. What ended up happening, and I haven't been doing a lot of news scanning because I was literally just until moments before I had to leave to come do this show in the Public Order Emergency Commission hearing room. So I haven't looked at a lot of news coverage, but they were filming his interview with Rebel and his interview with me. So if they want to run clips of Tom Marazzo, they'll have to be running clips from Rebels and my questions to Tom Marazzo, which I found a bit interesting. And one of the reporters who I get along with from one of the legacy media outlets when Pat King was coming out said, I don't know if he'll talk to us. Maybe you'll have better luck again. So I didn't get better luck, though. I wasn't able to get Pat King to stop. I've never actually met the guy before. But all of this is to say that Tom Marazzo drew a line in the sand. He made a choice. He said, I'm not going to talk to media that he says have been lying. And he brushed it off. And it was interesting because this was a bit of a contentious point if you talk to some of the convoy organizers. Benjamin Dichter, who is going to be testifying tomorrow, had a very similar line. He did that press conference infamously on the first weekend of the convoy. Rupa Subramanya was there. I was there. I don't know if Rebel was there. Kian Bexty of Countersignal was there. The National Telegraph was there. Epoch Times was there. CTV, Global, Toronto Star, they weren't there. CBC, they weren't there. CPAC, they weren't there. And they said, why would they give these people access when they're not going to represent and fairly portray the convoy? That was their approach. That was their attitude. Now, there's a more, I guess, romantic idea that, well, if you invite them in and you let them hear you, maybe you'll be able to win them over. But a lot of people just see them as belligerents in a war and not ones that are all that interested in fairly portraying the convoy thing. And I haven't talked to Tom Marazzo for too long after his testimony today, but it may be that his position is, look, I said a lot of what I want to say on the stand under oath. I'll talk to a couple of people that I trust to be fair with me. Why would I bother? What benefit is it to me to talk to Radio Canada, to talk to Le Devoir, to talk to Canadian Press or whoever else it was that was in that scrum wanting to talk to him? So I'm going to move on in a moment, but just because it is so delightful to watch, it was only 8 seconds. Here is again Tom Marazzo's grand exit down the hallway after he testified for a few hours on the stand in Ottawa.
Mr. Marazzo, let me ask you a couple questions.
You guys have been lying for 3 years. I don't want to talk to you.
there you have it. And if you want to keep watching it over and over again, like maybe you make it into your ringtone or something when the media calls you, it is on my Twitter, and you can just watch it in all of its glory there. Now, I will say, so I spoke to Tom Marazzo afterwards about something that didn't really come up as directly in his testimony, but I felt it was an important point because a lot has been made by protesters throughout these committee hearings or commission hearings about the idea that the federal government wanted to vilify. We spoke yesterday on the show about how the federal government was more interested in the narrative than it was in any purported public safety crisis or national security threat that the convoy was posing. And I think that's relevant here because the federal government had a choice. And even up until the moments leading up to when the Emergencies Act was decided, they had an opportunity to say, we can go with negotiation, or we can go with vilification, demonization, calling in the police, and all of that. And they chose door number 2. They were completely uninterested in discussion. They were completely uninterested in negotiation. But if you want to look at this through the parallel universe, in which Justin Trudeau comes out and says, yes, truckers, tell me what's your problem. Or they send Marco Mendicino or Chrystia Freeland or someone else out. That parallel universe, what does that actually look like? Do the convoy organizers say, okay, we've been heard, let's go home? And I asked Tom about that, and it's a hypothetical, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But a lot has been made of this idea of not getting a meeting. What would it have meant if they did get a meeting? These were the questions I asked him when he wasn't speaking to legacy media.
If Justin Trudeau or representatives of the federal government had met with you, what would your response have been, or those of your colleagues?
I would have clearly articulated why these mandates we believed were unjustified, immoral, illegal, and that Canadians had spoken and sent us to Ottawa to deliver that message and come up with a way to remove the mandates and then plot a way forward.
If they heard that message but didn't change policy, would that be enough for the protest to have said mission accomplished and go home in your view?
No, the objective was to get rid of all federal mandates. And leadership starts at the top, so if Justin Trudeau had decided to do the right thing, the right moral thing, and to listen to the wishes of Canadians, then maybe the premiers would have found their moral courage as well and started listening to people in this country. Because 2 years prior to the convoy, Canadians were protesting all over this country, and not one single politician heard those concerns.
That was Tom Marazzo, one of the, it's funny, he doesn't like the term organizer. When I spoke to him for the first time on air, I think it was like a week or 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks after the convoy wrapped up, and he had said he just wanted to be a volunteer. And then the more I talked to people, the more I learned how much of an integral role he played in some of the logistical operations, some of the communications. Now, again, there was a bit of friction around that and so on. But there he is saying, yeah, I mean, obviously the meeting alone wouldn't have meant that we would all just pick up and go home. But he said they wanted leadership and they wanted someone to hear them out. And his point I actually take as quite significant when he says that there was no politician in Canada willing to speak up. And people are going to say, oh, but what about Randy Hillier? What about Maxime Bernier? What about Roman Baber? And sure, you might find isolated examples, but no one in a mainstream political party, no one in government. And as we talked about yesterday, whether you're talking about Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, it didn't really seem to matter who was in power in a province. They all went, generally speaking, down that same road as far as COVID response. So political leadership would be important. And again, I mean, this has been one of the things that's come up a bunch of times. Oh, well, you know, why do you care about mask? I mean, mask mandates are provincial and Justin Trudeau is in Ottawa and, you know, you guys are so stupid. You don't know how government works. And Tom's saying that, listen, you know, a lot of provinces take their tone or take their leadership and their marching orders, not directly, but indirectly from the cues that the federal government is putting out. And I mean, you could debate how true that is. You know, I think certainly Doug Ford is taking a lot of cues from Justin Trudeau lately, but take from that what you will, and it's a bit of a different discussion. But the whole point is that this entire protest was really coming down to those two narratives. The one that was being peddled by the media that Tom Marazzo wouldn't speak to this afternoon in the hallway of Library and Archives Canada, and the story that people felt who were there to see it for themselves. And I want to play a clip that I found quite interesting from Keith Wilson's testimony today. And I can't remember offhand because I took the clip earlier on, and that was like, I don't know, a bajillion hours ago now. But he was being cross-examined by someone. It doesn't really matter who. And he tells a story that I found was very revealing about the grassroots nature of this and the widespread national support that the convoy got, even if the Ottawa bubble of journalists and politicians were against them. And it was a story about someone that wanted to do the most fundamental thing, which was donate fuel to the convoy.
But who was paying for all of that fuel, the big trucks, fuel at Coventry?
I know we put into, in your action with the Mariva injunction, there's details on that in the affidavits. But I also know that I was told by a businessman who wanted to donate fuel that he had contacted or had his office contact 3 different fuel suppliers and the bulk suppliers, and he wanted to pay for a shipment of fuel from each of them. They declined because they said the best they could do was put him on a waiting list. They had so many people phoning from across the country to pay for fuel to be delivered downtown that they actually didn't want his money, and they said all they could do is put him on a waiting list.
That was the lawyer was Paul Champ, who is representing the Coalition of Ottawa Residents and Businesses. And I've got a Paul Champ story to tell you a little bit later on about Pat King and all that. And by the way, we didn't have a guest today because I was doing some interviews and had a bunch of clips. So if you have any questions about the proceedings that you want me to answer about what's been happening or what's coming up, do let me know in the comment section. I don't know how many I'll get to, but if you have any questions as they come up and you are curious and want some more details, let us know, and we will try to get to a handful of those. But what Keith Wilson is saying there is that, there was a guy who wanted to donate fuel, and he wanted to go to the 3 major fuel distribution companies in the area and say, I'll order, I'll pay for an order from each of them. And their answer is get in line because everyone else from all over the country wants to pay for these things too, which is quite significant. And there was a line, I don't have a clip of it, but there was a line that Keith Wilson gave in his testimony today where he was quoting Tamara Leach. And it was quite a moving line. And he said that Tamara Leach understood that the money was a symbol. The money was not the cause of the convoy. The money was not the fuel of the convoy. The money was not the source of the convoy's power. The money was a symbol and was a symptom, to use a not as nice a term, but it was a symptom of the support that the convoy had. And it was a reflection of the support the convoy had. And I think that's quite exceptional. And still to this day, there has been such a tremendous lack of clarity surrounding this question of when this became an illegal protest. We hear the political rhetoric of this. Oh, it was an illegal blockade, an unlawful protest, an unlawful assembly. There are things that exist in law that actually qualify something as an unlawful assembly. And no one has so far tabled any evidence of when or how that came to be for the convoy protest until the government started the police started handing out those flyers saying, get out of here or we're going to arrest you. No one said, Keith Wilson testified and other convoy participants have testified, yes, this is illegal, you cannot be here. And in fact, police were the ones saying, yeah, you can park here when those early trucks started arriving. And this was a question that Keith Wilson raised in his testimony again today and still didn't really get an answer.
You note in the second bolded paragraphs that the intention is not to reimburse those committing unlawful acts or criminal acts, and you say the convoy has been clear it only supports peaceful assembly. At this point in time, I take it you were aware that there were some officials that were suggesting that some of the conduct going on was unlawful?
Yeah, and I've heard that a lot. And what I've always struggled with is at what point in time did those officials believe it became an unlawful assembly and on what basis? Because it just seemed to be a terminology that started to morph and become adopted with no particular triggering event or explanation as to what that individual or official thought constituted an unlawful assembly.
Not that linguistic precision is all that much a thing lately. Just ask anyone what like a woman is and you'll find out. But I mean, up is down and down is up and left is right and all of that. But his point, I think, is an incredibly important one. When was this an unlawful assembly? Were police telling people, hey, you have to go home, you can't be here? And there was one point, I think it was when the commissioner himself was asking Keith Wilson some questions at the end of cross-examination and re-examination and all of that. And he had asked a question along the lines of, did you ever ask police if it was an unlawful assembly? And Keith said no. And he said, did they ever ask you? No, sorry, that I'm mixing up sections. That was another point where someone was asking Keith, and I can't remember who it was at this point, if this ever really came up. And the answer was that he didn't have it. The part that I'm thinking of right now that I was mixing it up with, I think is also important, which is whether there was ever a discussion about an alternative protest zone. And this is interesting because the commissioner asked Keith Wilson about this at the end of Wilson's testimony. And he said, was there ever an opportunity that you understood where protesters could go, even with the Emergencies Act in place, and they could protest there, not with their trucks, but as pedestrians? And Keith said that was never offered. And then the commissioner had asked him, did you ever ask? And Keith said no. But this one I find to be very unique because the commissioner has asked this of a couple of people now. He's asked it of police. He's asked it of other convoy witnesses. And it's clear he's trying to get at something here which really deals with the nuances of it. Because remember, the Emergencies Act says it has to be subject to the Charter. The Charter includes the right to freedom of expression. It includes the right to freedom of assembly. Trucks may not have charter rights, but people do. So when police were all of a sudden removing people from city sidewalks, from areas where people who didn't even own trucks were assembling, that raises a question of why were they not offered an alternative area where they could go and continue their protest. And Keith Wilson he's like a machine. He did like a 40-minute scrum after he had been testifying for a good 3 hours. And that was one of the things that I asked him about and to get his thoughts on that. And here's that brief exchange.
Active agent from the CSIS. At the end of your testimony and cross-examination today, about whether police had offered any zone to protest in. And he's asked this of a couple of other witnesses as well. Where do you think that question's coming from?
Well, I mean, it's an important question from the commissioner because it illustrates one of the ways in which this could be de-escalated and managed. And I believe it's becoming more and more clear from the evidence that that's not what the Prime Minister was interested in. He was interested in escalation. He was interested in confrontation. And by the commissioner asking and exploring this topic so thoroughly about alternative options to de-escalate things indicates to me that he wants to ensure when he reaches his conclusion, is it the case that all these other alternatives were in fact not pursued?
If police had offered an option where you could continue to protest as individuals, but no trucks, no vehicles allowed, would that have been something you would have recommended protesters accept?
I think that would have been a natural progression. You could see how we were already on a trajectory of significantly lessening the footprint and converting it into a more traditional protest. So I think the progression that we were on was to consolidate Wellington. 75% of the vehicles leave to the remote locations, with half of those going home. People being shuttle bussed in, the mayor talked about that. And then I could have seen them saying, all right, maybe we put up barricades like they have now on Wellington Street at this very moment that the government put up and turn it into a pedestrian protest. I could have seen that a progression. That's what we were working towards. This idea that you can snap your fingers and resolve this it was a complex problem, as I testified, required a complex solution with phases to it. We were on our way to implementing those, and we got stuck.
That was lawyer Keith Wilson responding to my questions. As you can see, a bit of a popular guy after his initial testimony there. And I think what he's talking about there is a very important dimension of this. And it's one that I think is very critical and will hopefully come with a very clear determination or finding from the commissioner. And I think that a very significant aspect here is how committed was the government to de-escalation? Because remember, the Emergencies Act itself is abundantly clear. It says For something to be a public order emergency, it has to satisfy a couple of different criteria. Some of them are from the Emergencies Act, and those criteria are an emergency stemming from the presence of espionage or sabotage or foreign influence of some kind, and all of that stuff that there's really no argument in support of happening here. And then the other thing is it has to rise to such a level that it meets one of a couple of criteria, and then a third one, which is that the situation cannot be dealt with under existing laws, cannot effectively be dealt with under any other law in Canada, is, I believe, the precise wording. And this is so key, because even if you could make a case that there was a public order emergency by the Emergencies Act, which I don't think you can. And the OPP intelligence officer went line by line with Convoy lawyer Brendan Miller last week or 2 weeks ago about that, and said there was no evidence of any single one of those criteria. But even if you could make a case for that, you would still have to make an additional case for whether any other law in Canada could deal with the problem. And it's not whether police incompetence was preventing you from dealing with the problem. It's not anything like that. It is a question of whether it could have been dealt with under existing laws and existing authorities. And this is what police officers have said in the course of this. Now, I don't know, so it's funny, I said I'd take questions, and there are two questions about Paul Champ here. One is from Ryan, who says, who is the City of Ottawa lawyer representing? What percentage of downtown residents and businesses are actually pressing this charge? Now, I should say, Paul Champ is not the City of Ottawa lawyer. The municipal entity that is the City of Ottawa has its own lawyer, its own legal representation. Paul Champ is representing an ad hoc coalition of Ottawa residents and businesses. And he's also a guy that is attempting to bring a class action against has brought a lawsuit against them, and he's trying to make it into a class action. He was the guy that filed the lawsuit on behalf of Zexi Lee, that got the horn honking injunction and all that. And at the end of it, and we're trying to get the clip for you right now, this happened very late. It was literally the last thing to happen, one of the last things to happen before the proceedings wrap for the day. Paul Champ was giving Pat King the runaround, and he was taking a fairly aggressive tone with Pat King, and Pat King was taking a fairly aggressive tone with Paul Champ, and it got a little out of hand at the beginning, and then at the end, it got really out of hand. And there was a point, and just to preface this, a point where Paul Champ kind of complained that Convoy organizers are getting a whole week to talk, and Ottawa residents only got 1 or 2 days earlier on. And he didn't seem to like that. And this triggered a bit of a chaotic situation that I'll share information about with you in a couple of moments' time when we have that clip ready. But the reason I think it's relevant here is that if you're talking about de-escalation, you have to talk about what protesters were willing to do and what the government was willing to do. And there has been unrefuted, undisputed, uncontradicted testimony from police and Convoy organizers about all the stuff they were doing to negotiate, to move trucks onto Wellington Street, to get the remainder out, to try to work with truckers that were being a bit more stubborn and a bit more entrenched and so on. And there was a great exchange between Keith Wilson and the Government of Canada lawyer today about Wellington Street specifically, because the Government of Canada, they didn't like the Ottawa deal that would have gotten all the trucks out of the residential areas and onto Wellington, because that means the protests would have been concentrated on the street that federal government offices are. And Keith Wilson had a bit of a great gotcha on the Wellington Street question.
Who were you representing at the negotiations? Were you representing the leadership that you mentioned, that the directors of that company, the nonprofit company, the Freedom 2022, the president, Tamara Leach, and the vice president, Chris Barber, and the treasurer, Chad Eros? Beyond those people, who were your clients?
You've described them. That's accurate.
So you were not acting on behalf of all of the truckers?
That's correct.
So you had faith?
I had faith, and my faith in the same way, I would have quit practicing law, sir, a long time ago if I didn't have faith in the ability of people having civil and respectful discussions to resolve disputes.
But the objective of that agreement was to move 25% more trucks into the Wellington Street area. So it doesn't do anything to relieve that congestion.
It's fair, but we've already established, sir, that the road's blocked today. So I'm not sure if your concern is about the presence of trucks and Canadians, or whether your concern is about the road being blocked. It can't be the road being blocked because it's still blocked to this day by the government.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've been to Wellington Street, obviously, since I've been back in Ottawa for this, and you still cannot drive down Wellington Street. So if their issue is that there's needed to be a thoroughfare, people need to be able to drive down Wellington Street. Well, it has been closed since the government has kept it closed after the breakup of the Convoy back in February. And Keith Wilson, I think, very wisely pointed that out, among other observations. So I feel like I'm going through just like a laundry list of clips here, but I want to give you a sense of what's happening at these sessions, because they have a very aggressive schedule. They start at 9:30. They go for a couple of hours. They take a 15-minute break in and around 11:30. Then they come back. Then they go for a couple more hours, and they take a lunch break at 1 for an hour. And then they come back and they take another break like 2.5 hours later, 4:30. And then after that, they go, today it was maybe about 6:30 that they went until. Some days they've been pushing 8 o'clock. There have been rumors about them going later into the evening and perhaps even on weekends. And part of that is if they start adding witnesses, like, you know, they're battling in court to get Doug Ford and Sylvia Jones there. So that means they have to find time somehow to do this. So all of that is to say that, like, it's a very aggressive and intense schedule, but there's a lot, and there's a lot that you'll miss if you aren't paying attention. So our goal at True North is to try to like suffer through this whole thing so you don't have to, and give you the clips and stuff. And I mean, yesterday I think there was a bit more of a story to it, whereas today I'm just like bombarding you with stuff. But I also think it was very interesting, because you had, again, on one hand, this narrative that was emerging of this being this illegal protest, unlawful protest, then no one able to say when it became unlawful. You had this position that the government put forward that it was a fringe group. And then you also had people that were calling from all over the country saying, I want to buy them diesel, I want to buy them fuel. And I think all of this is a little bit curious, don't you think? So I will say, just before I move on from Keith Wilson's testimony here, it was a little bit interesting to me that at one point, the lawyer for, I believe it was the government of Canada again, was like getting him to play legal scholar in a weird way, and like asking him, as a lawyer, your thoughts about this, and as a lawyer, your thoughts about the limits of free speech, and as a lawyer, your thoughts on, you know, whether trucks have charter rights, and, you know, Hong Kong and all that. No, sorry, you can't say Hong Kong, because apparently to Liberal members of Parliament, that means Heil Hitler. So I denounce anyone who thinks that honking is synonymous with a Nazi revolution. But I will say that Keith Wilson had probably the line of the day when it came to his answer on hate speech. Take a look.
You agree hate speech has been codified in the criminal code, right?
Yes, and I find the Prime Minister's hate speech towards unvaccinated people and saying, how do we deal with these people, deeply troubling.
Right. So you don't agree then that threats against the life of somebody is not a protected form of speech under the Charter?
I do not believe that anyone, either morally or legally, should be threatening anyone else's life, and I have received many death threats myself since representing the Freedom Convoy.
The good part was the early part there about denouncing Justin Trudeau's hate speech against the unvaccinated. I would drop the mic, but I need to get through the rest of the show here, so I don't want to do that too much. But I think that was just that one doesn't even fit into the story. I just like the clip and I wanted to share it with you. But I did say I would get back to Paul Champ. So I was telling you, we have the clip now, and we'll play it in a moment. Now, this is from Paul Champ's questioning of Pat King. Now, this is, again, a very significant development. Pat King, controversial guy, and I will say, interestingly enough, I was expecting it to be a lot more of a circus than it ended up being. But a lot of the parties there didn't even have questions for him, and at one point I was in the hearing room, so I could see Pat King looked quite shocked when he found out that lawyers for the Ottawa Police Service and the Ontario Provincial Police and all that didn't have any questions for him. They didn't care to ask him anything. Now, Paul Champ rose to it. Now, Paul Champ rose to the challenge and said, yeah, I'm going to ask you questions. And he was asking very pointed questions about Pat King's bank account. And there was a very tense exchange where Pat accused Paul Champ of taking his money because of that lawsuit that got money put in escrow. And you can watch the whole thing. I think it was only like 15 minutes if you wanted to go back. But at the end of it, it kind of just devolved into what I would say is the more chaotic phase of the hearing. Now, I should say I was in the room. So I lived through it. I have no idea what's in this clip or how it's cut. So this is a bit of an adventure for both of us, but let's see how it looks.
They were all settled down by the time the convoy came, and there was no threats to anyone.
I've never seen anything more loving and peaceful in my life. Right. It was Woodstock.
So the only person who's at risk in Ottawa was Pat King. All the other threats to anyone else in Ottawa were all fake. Is that right?
I don't know. I can't speak on those. You know, my lawyer has been given death threats and bomb scares because she represents me. Do you know that my friends their children have been threatened from Ottawa? Do you know that, and I hate to say this, but this town is full of a bunch of people who really don't like people who speak out.
I disagree, Mr. King. Ottawa has dozens of large protests, many much larger than the one that you organized every single year.
I've been here for
I'm not sure that was a question.
Well, Mr. Commissioner,
can I just
Mr. Commissioner, I'll just note for the record that the people of Ottawa got one morning in this proceeding. We've had a week of all of these convoy organizers given a full platform to say whatever they want. The people in Ottawa respect the right to protest, and these folks are getting their time to say everything they want from
Can I say one? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm going to stop this. You'll get. Yeah. Hey,
please.
Could you ask have him? I'm going to take a break while you remove the person.
I'm sorry, sir.
The commission's in recess, la commission est levée.
So I like the True North flash there. Like that chaotic outburst was brought to you by True North. You're welcome. So they end up, once it's in recess, they no longer play the feed. It's not meant to be a live interrupted feed of the room, just of the proceedings. But what ended up happening there was they closed down the feed. The commissioner leaves the room. That guy kept going, and security removed him. Now he went out willingly, but he was barking all the way there. And there was another woman as well that then started to perk up, and it was the room just got a bit raucous. And to be honest, and I'm not blaming Paul Champ here, but it started when Paul Champ did that little soliloquy near the end, because he had finished his question. He had shut down his laptop with the tax the rich sticker on it, and they were, I thought, done. And what was interesting there, and so I said I didn't know what was on that clip. I couldn't hear it in the room, but could hear it in that video. Pat King trying to shut that down. And I actually, again, whatever you think of Pat King, I thought that was very classy. I did hear him say a little bit later on, imploring people after they had recessed to be respectful, but I didn't hear him do what he did in that, which was right into the microphone, where he said to the guy something like stop or don't or whatever, and then he said, I'm sorry, to the commissioner, which I thought was given the circumstances very gracious. So he didn't want the rambunctious audience, though that was the crowd he got. And I think this is the challenge of trying to put people in boxes and treat things like black and white. My producer just said, I wish he had responded when Paul Champ said, we have much bigger protests here too, and do you invoke the Emergencies Act over them? So this is why you should be up on the stand there, producer, but I'm not going to summon you to... I'm not going to give you a subpoena and make you fight it alongside Doug Ford or anything like that. But I will say that there is a fascinating dimension of all of this right now, which is that people are being confronted every day with hours and hours of testimony, and some of it is stereotype affirming. I mean, like when Zexy Lee and that other woman, whose name I can't remember right now, were going on about their phantom honking and stuff like that. It was like no one's mind was changed. When Pat King is talking, I don't think anyone's mind has changed. When Chris Barber was, I don't know if he was breaking through to anyone. I don't know if Tamara Lich will break through to anyone or not. I mean, there are a lot of preconceptions here that I think will be very fascinating for people. And one of them, which I'll discuss now a little bit, it's going to come up later on in the week. Jeremy Mackenzie, who's the founder of this online movement, group, or meme, depending on what you think of it, called Diagonlon, is going to be testifying from behind bars. Now, the federal government's lawyer was very, very interested in Diagonlon, very interested in Diagonlon. And when they had Tom Marazzo up on the stand, they played this video clip of Tom speaking at some veterans event, and he said, "I'd like to, acknowledge in this room Jeremy Mackenzie," and Jeremy Mackenzie stands up, and then everyone applauds him. Now, I have had a run-in with Jeremy Mackenzie, which I will share with you just for context here. I had never heard of the guy until whenever, it would have been February of 2020, I think it was. I was in Halifax because Omar Khadr was doing his first public speech. And there was this veteran, he was there, he was wearing his medals, who did a very impassioned interview outside of the venue. And he spoke about just how outraged he was. And this veteran, I saw doing the interview, and he was live streaming. He was, on his phone all night, and he was outside, and he was talking and doing whatever. And my general rule, if someone is live streaming, is I try to stay out of their way. And people in his audience thought that I was deliberately trying to avoid him, which I guess was technically true, but not because I knew who he was and was trying to avoid him, but just because I didn't want to get in the way of the guy's live stream. And people were saying, how dare you not interview this guy? And I said, well, someone else had interviewed him, and I didn't know who he was, and I've known since. And some of his fans have been very rabidly rude to me, which, I mean, be however you want. I don't really care. I've had a couple of just I think social media interactions with him, and I've never had any negative ones, but he's said things that I find absolutely abhorrent. Like when he made that, joke that he says is a joke a few weeks ago in some stream of wanting to rape Pierre Poilievre's wife. I'm like, this is just, it's vile. It's disgusting. And at the same time, I could believe that someone's political discourse is not contributing anything positive, while also saying that I don't believe they should be strung up and treated as though they're a part of something that the evidence doesn't support them as being a part of. And I think Diagonlon is a great example of this. And if you've never heard of it, I mean, I'll play this clip because I think Tom Marazzo can explain it a little bit better than I can.
Sir, how do you know Mr. Mackenzie?
He does, he has a podcast, and he does a lot of political satire and comedy. He does some serious videos sometimes. He is the creator of a fictitious meme on the internet known as Diagonlon, which I assume what you're going to ask me about. And the vice president of Diagonlon being a time-traveling, cocaine-addicted goat. That is just a internet meme that has no meaning at all. And I had spoken to Jeremy the first time when I was in Ottawa on the phone. And the second time I spoke to Jeremy was when the Liberal government was debating whether or not they should use the Emergency Act, and they were citing this fictitious goat that time travels as a domestic terrorist group and justification for invoking the Emergency Act. And I saw a video that Jeremy and his friends were doing, and they were laughing hysterically, showing clips of the government actually talking about Diagonlon as being a real thing. Everybody knew it was a joke. When I saw the video, I contacted Jeremy and I said, tell me everything there is to know about Diagonlon. He said, if you draw a diagonal line from Alaska through Alberta to Texas, it makes a diagonal line. And that's why it's called Diagonlon. They're the only states and provinces that don't have mask mandates. And he used it as a joke. He made the symbol for Diagonlon in a second on his cell phone because it's a joke. And it is meaningless. He did it to attract attention for people to come to a barbecue and to have a lot of fun. That were, people wanted to have a barbecue without masks on. A bunch of strangers that didn't know each other. And yet here he was watching members of parliament in the Liberal Party actually joking or actually seriously stating that the reason for invoking the Emergency Act was because of Diagonlon. Like, it was the most outrageous, ridiculous thing I had ever seen. And I think this commission should be investigating that as the biggest intelligence joke of, the last decade. It's a joke. Diagonlon is a joke. It's not even a real thing.
And I think that's very important. And I'm assuming Jeremy Mackenzie will say something very similar. Right? I talked about it a bit in my book. And I get emails from people occasionally saying, why are you not covering Jeremy Mackenzie? And it's, again, I don't know him. I can't offer any insights beyond what's in the public record. And there's a lot of what is in the public record from him that I find deeply concerning. I'm not going to line up to defend him as being this, incredible example of, a podcaster, broadcaster, or even a human being. But I could still say that I have not seen any evidence that supports him being at the heart of anything constituting a national emergency. And it shouldn't be controversial to say that. And before, I don't know, like the, frigging mainstream media just decided to jump up and down and say, True North's defending Jeremy Mackenzie. No, it's not about defending a person. It's about just saying, where is the evidence for this assertion that you're making? And I thought, I didn't know about this, cocaine-addicted goat that apparently is the vice president of the fictitious country. And in fact, when I say that, I'm like, was there like acid in my coffee or something? And I'm just, having some very bad reaction right now. No, this is exactly what's happened in this process. People have just made these unhinged assertions, and they've been allowed to go for the better part of a year completely and utterly unchallenged. And you have to hope that the truth is going to find its way through this process. And I want to take just a couple of more questions before we wrap things up here, because we had a couple of very good ones. Pat says, is Trudeau going to have to testify? Trudeau is testifying. He is, I believe, the last name on the witness list. So he is going to be the last one to testify. Now, I don't know how long he is going to be testifying. I don't know if he's just going to slip it in on his lunch break, or if he's going to allow himself to be examined for an entire day. Remember, Peter Slowly, he spent 2 full days on the stand. He was examined on Friday for the full day, and then he was cross-examined by the various parties on Monday of this week for the full day. I would love to see Justin Trudeau go through the same thing. Suze writes, if the we're getting very casual now, the commish. If the commissioner finds it illegal to have been invoked, could people charge Parliament? Now, I don't know if you mean like charge or if you mean like file charges, but either way, the answer is no. And I should say, at the end of this, it's not actually clear yet what form of determination the commissioner will publish. So he's not finding any legal fault. He's not finding any criminal or even civil liability. He is supposed to assess the basis of the Emergencies Act. Now, he could say the government was unjustified, or he could just make a bunch of observations and not actually come out with a clear determination that, yes, it was right, and no, it wasn't. And that, I think, will be very frustrating for people, because there may be an option here for the government to just say, yes, we've learned some lessons, but we weren't actually found in the wrong, because, no, that's not the point of the mandate. Nancy writes, how much longer will the inquiry go for? So the hearings are going for, we're at the halfway point today. So the hearings will go for another 15 business days. Now, the variable in that is, of course, if they decide to start adding more business days, if they decide to start sitting on weekends or extending the sitting. And then the report has to be tabled by February on the 1-year anniversary of, I believe, the revocation of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So basically, the Tuesday following the Emergencies Act, that weekend, it was when they revoked it. So a year from that. And what else? Barbara writes, Rupa or Viva testifying. So I actually saw Rupa Subramanya, my colleague, was there today. We chatted a little bit, and she is not, as far as I know, on the witness list. Neither is Viva. Is it Viva Frey? Viva Frey? I'm sorry, I should know this, but I know how to spell it. But Viva, I don't know if he's not on the witness list that's been public. Neither am I, but I should say that today I was quoted twice. The lawyer for former Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly was asking witnesses about my book. And they had it up on the screen there, and he's like, so you did an interview with Mr. Lawton. And I'm like, oh, crap, what did I do? But it wasn't bad, thankfully. So with that, I am going to say farewell to you tonight. Now, we will be back with Fake News Friday, and some of the media reactions from this week will certainly bear scrutiny. And I am going to continue my reporting of the Public Order Emergency Commission, which you can catch on my Twitter at Andrew Lawton and also at tnc.news. So hope you have a great rest of the week, everyone. Thank you. God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.